ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. What have we looked at so far? Just to ensure that people are awake and live. So far we've had 3 lessons. This is the 4th, and it's not the final one, unlike what it says on the poster, because we're going to need a lot more time to get through the material, which is not a problem, because alhamdulillah, knowledge is knowledge. So if we take away anything beneficial, then that's a bonus. So far in 3 weeks, what have we been looking at?
Different approaches to knowledge.
Okay, different approaches to knowledge, different approaches to understanding, revelation, yeah?
The hadith through the centuries.
Okay, the development of hadith over the centuries. And what's so significant about hadith? Why is it so important?
Because it's the word of Allah, as well as
It's the word of Allah.
It's being revealed to the Prophet ﷺ.
It's revelation from Allah, definitely. And this revelation from Allah is what? In relation to the Quran. Tafsir, bayan, clarification. Whenever we think hadith or sunnah, we should automatically think explanation of the Quran. Automatically. Don't hesitate on that. The moment we think hadith or sunnah, we should immediately connect it to the Quran. Because when we detach them, there's a problem. There's a problem. And that's actually what a lot of people are attempting to do. Not just today, in previous times as well. And this is something that was very early on. People trying to belittle the sunnah, belittle hadith, and say this is not from Allah, this is the word of Allah, and Allah says this is sufficient, so why are you talking to me about hadith? Yeah. Allah says this book is a guidance. وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And it's a cure, and it's a mercy. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. That book, in which there's no doubt, it's a guidance for the people of piety. So if the Quran is a guidance, then why do you need the Sunnah? We say because the Quran itself is commanding us to refer back to the Messenger ﷺ in tons of verses. Tons, not just 1 or 2. And so therefore, the Sunnah is really part of the Quran. It's from the Quran. It's not from anywhere else. So that's something really important to keep in mind. The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is an interpretation of the Quran. It's a clarification of the Quran. And the scholars of the past and present are continuing to say this over and over again. And we said that one of the objectives of the Messenger is to... What are some of the main objectives of the Prophet ﷺ? Spread the message, but in relation to the Quran, what is it? Explain it, teach the Quran. Several verses mention this. Several verses mention that a Prophet was sent in order to teach you the verses of God, to recite the verses of God to you and to teach the book. So that shows that the Quran and understanding the Quran are 2 separate things. And what good is the Prophet ﷺ explaining to the Quran to us when that explanation is no longer with us? What use is that? So from the whole ummah till the day of judgment, we only have a handful of people who are actually benefiting from the Prophet. The rest of us, we might as well not have a Prophet. Why is there a Prophet in the first place? To send the Quran? We have the Quran. We have the Quran. We have the book, the Quran. If the Messenger wasn't necessary, he will reveal a book to us and we have the Quran and it suffices. So the fact that the Messenger was a necessity shows that he's a necessity until the Day of Judgment for all people. And I repeat this over and over again because this belittling of the words of the Prophet ﷺ or explanation of the Prophet ﷺ is a way to destroy the religion. It's a way to ensure that Islam collapses, which will never happen, alhamdulillah. But it's just something to be aware of. Why? Because the moment you detach the book from the prophet who was sent to explain the book, you give people a free-for-all to understand the book as they wish and to interpret the Quran as they wish. And when people wanted to free themselves from the shackles of the church and the shackles of the Bible and the authority of religion, this is one of the first steps to it. That's to say that the interpretation of the Bible is something subjective. Anybody can interpret it as they wish. And therefore you have Christians who are justifying homosexuality and Christians who are justifying the worship of a human being who is God incarnate and so on. All of that starts from this idea of opening up the door of interpretation freely and loosely. We're not saying that the Quran is closed off in a group of people. Only they can understand it. No one else can understand the Quran. Absolutely not. Everyone can understand the Quran. But some effort has to be put in at least. Everyone can become a doctor. No one's saying to you only the doctors are allowed to be doctors and no one else is allowed to go near medicine. You can become a doctor as well, but you have to put the effort in and train. Do something to become a doctor. Don't just sit there and then think that your opinion should be valid. It doesn't work like that for anything. So why should it work like that for the words of God that are a guidance for people? Everyone can understand the Quran. Some things are easily understandable without having much knowledge because they're simple and clear, and generally speaking that's the Quran. But if you want to become someone who has a say and a word, etc., no problem, but put the effort in. Put the effort in, study and work. We looked at the development of Islamic law, how the companions looked at it, how the tabi'een, the followers of the companions, looked at things, and then we got to the 4 schools of fiqh. Okay, we got to the 4 schools of fiqh. We said that the number of scholars at the time of the 4 Imams, were they just 4? No. Were they more than 4? Much more. Much more. Are these 4 Imams, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i and Ahmad, are they the most knowledgeable scholars to have ever existed? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. In fact, Al-Imam al-Shafi'i, who is the student of 2 leading scholars. Who knows these 2 leading scholars? And al-Shafi'i compares between them. Malik is one of his teachers. And who's the other? Good, Al-Layth. Al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Malik was in Medina and Al-Layth ibn Sa'd was in Egypt. Al-Shafi'i says, Al-Laythu afqahu min Malik. Al-Layth is more knowledgeable than Malik. وَلَكِنْ ضَيَّعَهُ أَصْحَابُهُ. But his students let him down. Malik had students who carried his knowledge, taught it, spread it around the world. This is why 1,300 or 1,200 or more years later, we have people following the understanding of Malik of the Quran and the understanding of Malik of the prophetic teachings. Allah willed it like that. Allah wanted for these 4 schools to be preserved. And that's how it is. That's simply how it is. And it's not a problem. If the madhab of Al-Layth was preserved instead of Malik, we would have no problem. Because ultimately our concern is a proper understanding of the words of God and a proper understanding of the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. If we have that, we're not interested in Malik as an individual. Malik as an individual isn't, the religion isn't built upon him as a person. Nor Abu Hanifa. The Ummah could have done without Abu Hanifa. The Ummah could have done without Malik. And that's not to be disrespectful. That's just to say that Allah willed for a wisdom of His that Abu Hanifa remains, Malik remains, Shafi'i remains and Ahmad remain for such a long period of time. That needs to be understood so that a person appreciates the importance of these scholars, because otherwise Allah wouldn't have wanted them to remain for the Ummah. And at the same time they should know that there are scholars other than these 4. It's not just 4 scholars that we're talking about. Just as there were hundreds of companions, but remember we said only a few of the companions actually had many students and almost had a school which then later developed. Some of these companions included. Who were some of these companions who had many students? And Abu Hurairah had students, but it didn't develop into some sort of school where they carried his knowledge and fiqh. He narrated a lot of knowledge, huh? Anyway, Zayd ibn Thabit, for example. Abdullah ibn Abbas in Mecca. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, we said in Kufa. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was the king of Al-Kufa when it came to knowledge. Knowledge went through him and trickled down onto the followers after him. So last week we mentioned about Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and the 4 Imams. Abu Hanifa, his name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. He's from Kufa. He studied for a long period of time with Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who was his teacher. And Hamad is the student of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is considered the inheritor of the knowledge of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He's not his direct student, he's the student of his students. So Ibrahim al-Nakha'i didn't meet Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, but Ibrahim is considered the inheritor of the knowledge of Ibn Mas'ud. And he was considered a huge scholar in his own right. And he had followers and he had students. And in fact, many of Abu Hanifa's positions directly come from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. And Kitab al-Athar by Al-Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, which is a book of hadith. A book of hadith and narrations. Many of these narrations are narrations from Ibrahim. Okay, Ibrahim said this, Ibrahim said that, Ibrahim said this, Ibrahim said that. That shows that knowledge is inherited, generation after generation. Yeah, it's not taken from books. Knowledge is inherited generation after generation. And books are a supportive means. Books are there to support, to further add, to perfect, to add tahqiq and strength to a person's knowledge. But it's not the base. The base is taking knowledge from individuals. Abu Hanifa had 3 main students. Who were they? Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, who was the most senior, and who else was a leading student of his? Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, who is considered, he is basically the Hanafi madhab. Muhammad is basically the Hanafi madhab. Because it was through him that the madhab of Abu Hanifa spread. Yeah, it was through him that the madhab of Abu Hanifa spread. Abu Yusuf, although he had classes and he taught and he had students, of course, but he was busy with being a judge because he was the head judge of the state at the time, the head judge. Qadi al-Qudah, as they used to refer to him. Whereas Muhammad authored a number of books. These books are referred to by the Hanafi scholars as Zahir al-Riwayah. Zahir al-Riwayah. Zahir al-Riwayah is the narrations that come from Muhammad ibn Hassan from Abu Hanifa. These are considered the most authoritative books in the Hanafi school because they are directly from the students of Muhammad. This is important. Why is it important? Because we're talking about 1,200 years here. So in 1,200 years, it's quite possible, and it's a reality, that opinions are attributed to Abu Hanifa which may not be accurate opinions. Someone claims this is Abu Hanifa's position and it's not. So when we have books authored by his direct student, that gives us authenticity. Yeah? وكتب ظاهر رواية أتت ستا وبالأصول أيضا سميت صنفها محمد الشيباني حرر فيها المذهب النعماني وبالأصول أيضا سميت. They call them الأصول as well. كتب ظاهر الرواية are الأصول as well. الجامع الصغير والكبير والسير الصغير والكبير ثم الزيادات مع المبسوط تواترت بالسند المضبوط. As Ibn Abidin rahimahullah says in his poem on the usul of Hanafi Iftah. So 6 books amongst the Hanafis that are considered the most authoritative books. Some of them say it's 5 and they make 2 of these books as 1 book. But the point is, Muhammad is the one who spread the madhab of Abu Hanifa. So if you find something in the books of Muhammad that's more authoritative than anything that comes later, that's common sense because he's the student of Abu Hanifa. The final most important student of Abu Hanifa is who? What's his first name? He's better known as his first name, something ibn al-Hudayl, Zufar ibn al-Hudayl. And they say about Zufar ibn al-Hudayl rahimahullah that he was the sharpest when it came to fiqh and qiyas. A very sharp scholar when it came to fiqh and qiyas. This is one thing that stands out in the madhab of Abu Hanifa. The students of Abu Hanifa were very, very strong. And they developed his fiqh from very early on. Contrary to the madhab of Ahmed, Imam Ahmed. Imam Ahmed was a muhaddith. And because he was a muhaddith, he was a strong athari. And didn't like opinion, and didn't like ra'i, and didn't like his opinions to be written down. So that's why his fiqh was written down and recorded a little bit later on, in a more organized way. Yeah? But Abu Hanifa, his madhab was being taken care of quite early on. What stands out about Abu Hanifa rahimahullah? His sharpness in fiqh stands out. His sharpness in his knowledge of fiqh stands out. Now, we spoke in the last lesson about two schools. We said Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i. Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i. Abu Hanifa was considered the leader of Ahlul Ra'i, that school. And we said there was tension between the schools. Why was there tension? It was a tension relating to the approach of understanding hadith and dealing with hadith. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah had a certain way of dealing with hadith, just as Malik had a certain way of dealing with hadith, just as Ahmad had a certain way of dealing with hadith. Because Abu Hanifa and Malik were very early on, and they relied very much on transmitted fiqh, you find that it is more likely that Abu Hanifa or Malik contradict the apparent meaning of a hadith than a Shafi'i and Ahmad. When I say apparent meaning, that doesn't mean it's wrong, because maybe the meaning that's not apparent is the appropriate meaning of a hadith. So it doesn't mean it's a wrong thing or a bad thing, but it just means that Abu Hanifa relied so much on transmitted fiqh plus his qiyas and so on. Similarly, Malik relied so much on the transmitted knowledge of the scholars of Medina. So if ever there was a clash, and we gave an example last week, a clash between the apparent wording of a hadith and between transmitted knowledge. What did Malik do? Malik said, this is transmitted knowledge. This counts like 10 ahadith. I'm not going to leave 10 ahadith for one hadith. So therefore I have no option but to interpret this one hadith in a way that makes it fit with this practice that is transmitted. Abu Hanifa does the same thing. And we gave the example of raising the hands last week. And that's just one example. And there are a number of examples that is specific to the madhab of Kufa, Ahlul Ra'i. Abu Hanifa considers that knowledge taken from the scholars of fiqh is to be given priority over knowledge transmitted by scholars who are not scholars of fiqh. And therefore, when some of the people said to him, why do you not raise your hands in salah? Even though we have a hadith from Abdullah ibn Umar and others that the Prophet ﷺ raised his hands in prayer. He said, I have a transmission from Ibn Mas'ud and Ibrahim and Hamad. Hamad is more knowledgeable in fiqh, Ibrahim is more knowledgeable in fiqh, and Ibn Mas'ud is more knowledgeable in fiqh than the narrators that he mentioned. They say to Al-Awza'i, and Allah knows best. So the point is, the way he dealt with hadith was different. And that brought him a lot of criticism. That's what brought him a lot of criticism. To the extent that scholars of hadith would author books rebuking and rebutting Abu Hanifa. And Ibn Abi Shaybah rahimahullah, who's from the leading scholars of hadith, has a whole chapter in his Musannaf. In his Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah, he has a chapter called Ar-Raddu ala Abi Hanifa, refuting Abu Hanifa. And in this chapter, he mentions the position of Abu Hanifa, and then mentions all the ahadith he has that contradict that position. Mentions the position of Abu Hanifa, and then the ahadith that he has that contradict the madhab of Abu Hanifa. When you come to study these ahadith and the opinions of Abu Hanifa, you find actually there is some scope here. There is scope. And but because the scholars of hadith, and they had a valid concern, by the way. Don't think, oh, these guys are rough, man. Why Abu Hanifa, someone like him, and they're attacking him? And they had a valid concern. That valid concern is opening up the door to not taking with the hadith. That's a valid concern. Because if that door was opened up, it would be a problem. But what many of them didn't realize, which is why many of them initially were critical of Abu Hanifa and then later on changed their approach and started respecting him a lot more. When they realized that actually this guy isn't there to play around with hadith. He has genuine reasons for not taking with our opinion. And the interesting thing is, their own friend Sufyan al-Thawri agrees with Abu Hanifa on so many opinions, but Sufyan never got the criticism. Why did Sufyan never get so much criticism? Because Sufyan was Amir al-Mu'mineen al-Hadith. Sufyan al-Thawri was from Kufa. He doesn't raise his hands in Salah. Same as Abu Hanifa's position. He considers that touching the private parts doesn't break wudu. He considers the permissibility of Nabidh. He considers a number of opinions which were known amongst Ahl al-Kufa. But Sufyan didn't get the criticism that Abu Hanifa got, because Sufyan was an Imam in Hadith. And this shows that it was more the worry about the approach that the scholars were worried about at that time. And like I said, anyhow, the scholars of Hadith, many of them later on realized the status of Abu Hanifa and his approach. And Abu Hanifa doesn't need validation. He doesn't need validation. Why does he not need validation? Because Allah gave him acceptance on earth. So if someone's given acceptance on earth by Allah, no human being is needed to validate him. That's a reality. That's a reality. Allah will not give acceptance on earth for an individual amongst the bulk of the Muslims, almost all the Muslims, unless this person is a person of knowledge and piety and taqwa. That's something that you can't doubt. And this is why Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, even though the position of Ahl Sunnah is that you should not witness Jannah or Jahannam for any person. You shouldn't say he's going to hell or he's going to paradise. Even if someone dies as a disbeliever, we don't have the right to say he's going to hell. And if someone dies as a believer, we also don't have the right to say he is going to paradise. But we're hopeful. We're optimistic for the one who dies believing in God, and we're not very optimistic for the one who dies rejecting Allah. But we still can't be certain, because Allah does whatever He wills. And it is disrespectful to put ourselves in a position where we speak on behalf of Allah. But when it came to scholars who were widely accepted in the Ummah, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah says, if somebody was to say he will be in Jannah, they would have a valid reason for doing so. And then he mentioned some examples: Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Malik, Abu Hanifa, Shafi'i, etc. Why? Because the whole Ummah has accepted them. And the Prophet ﷺ says in the famous hadith, when the companions commented on an individual, قَالَ وَجَبَتْ وَجَبَتْ. It will certainly happen, it will certainly happen. Because the companions spoke good of the individual, so he said wajabat. He's certainly going to enter paradise. Because if he's loved amongst the people of righteousness and people of piety, that's an indication. That only happens for someone who is honest. Anyhow, so this is a lesson. Why is it a lesson? Because sometimes people are confused when they see that there are comments about another scholar. There's nothing to be confused about. There's nothing to be confused about. These are human beings, they had opinions. Sometimes those opinions were critical, sometimes those opinions were harsh. Sometimes those opinions were extreme. Sometimes those opinions are unnecessary and exaggerated and wrong. There's nothing wrong with saying that sometimes an opinion can be held by a scholar about another scholar which is simply wrong. We're talking about human beings here. Yes, no doubt they're the best of the best when it comes to preserving the religion, understanding the Quran, teaching the Quran, spreading the Sunnah, no doubt. And that's why we follow in their footsteps. But that doesn't mean every letter that comes out of a person's mouth is perfection. And so therefore, if you see that there is strong dispute between certain madhahib, Abu Hanifa and some of the Imams of Hadith, or the later scholars, the Ash'aris and the Hanabila, and there's a strong dispute amongst them, and this and that, it's not a huge thing to be concerned about. It's not a huge thing to pay attention to, because ultimately, on the Day of Judgment, Allah holds us to account for those things that are clear-cut. We're held to account on the Day of Judgment for the clear-cut teachings of the Quran. We're not held to account for the nitty-gritty that some of the scholars disagree over. They've completed the foundations of knowledge. They've reached a level where they're now discussing the details of knowledge. So let them discuss what they want to discuss. We're not going to enter Jahannam just because we don't understand a mas'ala which is an intricate issue that some of the scholars have discussed. And this is one of the flaws of da'wah today. We're just dragging everyone into any type of knowledge. Drag everyone in, get everyone involved. So everyone wants to know why the Ash'ariyah and the Hanabila are disagreeing, and everyone wants to know the position of Abu Hanifa, and everyone wants to know the position on this position, that position. That's not for everybody. It's not for everybody, and it's not even beneficial knowledge for someone who hasn't perfected knowledge that is foundational. And it doesn't affect one's iman one bit. So Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, as I said, is the leader of one of the greatest and biggest schools. From Muhammad, knowledge was transmitted. Every school has some scholars who put an effort into preserving the fiqh, the knowledge of the scholar, and scholars who worked hard to defend those positions using hadith and using evidences. So Abu Hanifa had certain students who were scholars in hadith. When I say students, I mean anyone down the line of the Hanafi madhab. Who was one of the most well-known scholars of hadith in the Hanafi madhab? He's considered like al-Bayhaqi of the Shafi'i madhab. Al-Tahawi, Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. This guy authored Sharh Mushkil al-Athar, and Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi rahimahullah is an Imam al-Hadith, and he put a lot of effort into explaining the reasoning behind the Hanafi positions. So don't be critical of any position in the Hanafi school until you've read Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi's justification. If you find justification still not convincing, then that's another story. But it's not right to comment before that, because then you've only you've only looked at one perspective, and that's fine if you look at one perspective. You can follow that one perspective, but you're not in a position to criticize the other perspective until you know that perspective very well as well, and are in a position of qualification to be critical. Who knows some of the leading scholars of Hanafis down the history of the Hanafi school? Let's start as early back as we can and then work our way down. We have Abu al-Hasan al-Karhi, who came just after al-Tahawi. We have Abu al-Layth al-Samarqandi. We have Abu Bakr al-Jassas. Al-Jassas has written a number of books. He's written al-Fusul in Usul al-Fiqh in 2 volumes, printed today in 2 volumes. He's written also Ahkam al-Quran. So he's looking at the legal rulings that are taken from the Quran. This is a great book and a very important book. The legal rulings taken from the Quran. This is Abu Bakr al-Jassas. After him, we have al-Quduri, who's written a few books. Famous book, Mukhtasar al-Quduri, which is a beginner's book in Hanafi fiqh. And he's also written Tajreed, which is like a discussion between the Hanafis and Shafi'is. After him, Qadi Khan and Al-Kasani. Al-Kasani has a very important book called Bada'i al-Sana'i. And this guy, when he showed his teacher this book, Bada'i al-Sana'i, his teacher was very impressed with it. And he said, I have to marry you to my daughter, after seeing such a high-level book. And it really is a high-level book, because he's arranged it in an exceptional way. And only when I started reading in this book did I realize how impeccably he's organized this book. Such a well-organized book, and it discusses so many issues. It's printed in about 10 volumes, very big book. Bada'i al-Sana'i. Al-Hidayah by al-Marghinani is an important book. And some of them said, إن الهداية كالقرآن قد نسخت ما جاء قبلها من الكتب, or something like that, in a poem. He said the Hidayah of the Hanafis is like the Quran. قد نسخت. It's abrogated everything that's come before it. So just as the Quran has abrogated the previous scriptures, they say Al-Hidayah has abrogated all the previous books. So everything that's in Hidayah that's the final opinion. Al-Hidayah is by Al-Marghinani. Of course, that's an exaggeration. No one should refer to a book other than Allah's book like that. But his intention, if we think well of him, his intention is to indicate the importance of Al-Hidayah. Fettah al-Qadir by Kamal ibn Humam, as well as Radd al-Muhtar by Ibn al-Abidin. Radd al-Muhtar is much later on, only 200 or so years ago. But it's such a relied upon book. That's why it's important to mention. This book is printed in about 12 volumes now, or more, depending on the print. And it mentions the details of the fiqhi opinions in the Hanafi school. One thing that we notice in the Hanafi madhab is that there are scholars who had different approaches in the Hanafi school. And this applies across the board, other schools as well. That's so important to think, to realize. Because some people think Hanafi madhab is like one thing. And then Hanafi madhab is one thing. It's not one thing. Abu Hanifa's own students couldn't agree with him. Abu Hanifa's own students disagreed with him on so many different issues. And that shows that this idea of a madhab being just one opinion is not correct. It's not correct. Yes, it is true. The scholars of every madhab have put a lot of effort into coming out with the most appropriate opinion. And because so much effort has been put into that, that opinion is to be respected, no doubt. But does it mean that that opinion is binding on the whole ummah? No. No, absolutely not. And this is why you'll find that the Hanafi scholars themselves have different opinions, have different views. Okay, they have different approaches. Some lean towards an approach in hadith, like Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. And from the later scholars, Shaykh Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri, as well as Shaykh Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, two Indian scholars from recent times, very recent scholars. Shaykh Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi and Shaykh Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri. Even Shaykh Yunus al-Jampuri, who passed away not too long ago, rahimahullah. Shaykh Yunus al-Jampuri was someone who's very closely connected to Sahih al-Bukhari, studied Sahih al-Bukhari for his whole life. These are Hanafi scholars, but they're Hanafi scholars with a breath of hadith in them. So they will choose sometimes opinions within the Hanafi school, which is not necessarily the opinion that's in the Hidayah, or in Bada' al-Sana'i, or elsewhere. But they say this is a more appropriate opinion because it's more in line with the hadith, for example. And other scholars don't go with that approach. But the point that should be understood is that the Hanafi madhab, or the Maliki, or Shafi, or Hanbali madhab is not one thing. And that's what we want. We don't want things to be just one thing, because that makes things very rigid for people. And this is why one of the leading Hanafi scholars of our times, Mufti Taqi Uthmani, who is from Pakistan, he is someone who specializes in Islamic finance. And he admits and says, when it comes to Islamic finance and financial transactions and trade, etc., there is no way we can stick to the Hanafi school. There's no way. Because we have so many new issues that have arisen today that have to be dealt with. That generation had scholars that dealt with their problems. We have a generation where we have our own problems we need to deal with. And if we restrict ourselves to one opinion, which is not the opinion of the Quran, if it was the Quran, okay, no problem. The Quran says zina is haram, zina is haram. It doesn't matter how much conditions change. It doesn't matter how widespread fornication becomes, it remains haram until the Day of Judgment. Because that's a legal ruling from God. But when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran of some scholars, that's respected, it's trusted, it can be followed by those who are not scholars, but it's not the Quran. And so it's not binding on everyone. And this is actually a blessing, that we have some rulings that are clear-cut and can never change, and other rulings where more scope is given. That's a blessing for the Ummah. That's a blessing for the Muslims. Because that means that our religion doesn't get watered down so much that nothing remains, to the extent that we don't know whether our God is one or three. And at the same time, our religion doesn't become so rigid that despite changing circumstances and changing issues arising and new problems arising, our religion doesn't have answers that suit people. Because that's what fiqh is. Fiqh is resolving people's problems, organizing people's lives in a way that's consistent with the Book of Allah and the teachings of the Messenger ﷺ. That's what fiqh is. Anyhow, Malik rahimahullah had some students. His most important, most well-known students are three, all of them Egyptians, or all of them later went to Egypt. Even though Malik was of course in Medina. His most famous student is Abdurrahman ibn Qasim. Abdurrahman ibn Qasim al-Utaqi, rahimahullah, who, he was like the shadow of Malik. He was with him constantly, studied with him for a long period of time, and people would go to him to know what the opinions of Malik are, because he was his close student. Also Ashhab ibn Abdul Aziz was a well-known student of Malik, and the final one is Abdullah ibn Wahb. Abdullah ibn Wahb was a student of Malik, and he was also a student of Al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Al-Layth and Malik are contemporaries. Okay? I know a lot of names can be difficult, but it's helpful to know who's who. It's helpful to know who's who and who lived when. Otherwise we don't distinguish between the one who lived 100 years after the Prophet and the one who lived 100 years before us. And there's a huge difference between those two. So these three scholars, Ibn al-Qasim, Ashhab and Ibn Wahb, they were close students of Malik, and all of them went to Egypt. And they taught the fiqh of Malik in Egypt. Suhnun, who is one of the students of Ibn Wahb and Ibn Qasim, he decided to compile some questions for Abdurrahman ibn Qasim. What's the opinion of Malik on this issue? What's the opinion of Malik on this? What's the opinion of Malik on this? What's the opinion of Malik on this? And Abdurrahman ibn Qasim would answer him each time. And if he didn't have an answer, he would say, I don't know anything from Malik on this issue, but I say this. So he gives his view. His view based on what he knows from Malik's principles and Malik's knowledge. And Ibn Qasim was a scholar in his own right. Okay, he's a scholar in his own right. This book is called what? Al-Mudawwana. Al-Mudawwana. This Mudawwana is considered the most authoritative text in the Maliki madhab, and the later books were very much based upon this. Obviously we have the most important text in the Maliki madhab, which is the Muwatta of Malik. The Muwatta of Malik. Because the Muwatta of Malik is Malik's own words, his own direct words, his own knowledge, his own hadith. But Al-Mudawwana is more detailed. Al-Mudawwana is more detailed. And so that's a very important reference also when it comes to that. Some key figures in the Maliki madhab include Al-Hafiz ibn Abdul Barr. Ibn Abdul Barr was from those who were imams in hadith. Yeah. Just as At-Tahawi played a role for the Hanafis, Ibn Abdul Barr played this role for the Malikis. Okay, he wrote in the evidences of the Maliki madhab. He explained the Muwatta of Malik in two different books. One is a more hadithi explanation and one is a more fiqhi explanation. He had a contemporary also in Andalus. Where was Ibn Abdul Barr? In Andalus, Spain. Yeah? Ibn Abdul Barr was a Spanish scholar. Of course, now if someone says he was a Spanish scholar, that doesn't seem to fit, because we're not used to hearing about Spanish scholars. But he was a Spanish scholar, because Al-Andalus was a Muslim land, of course, back then. So was Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm also Andalusian, but he wasn't Maliki. We'll come to him later on. His contemporary also in Andalus was Abu al-Walid al-Baji. He was a scholar in the Maliki madhab, and he had a lot of back and forths with Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm was very anti-Maliki, and the Malikis were very anti-Ibn Hazm. So there was a lot of back and forth between these two schools. Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, he's from the leading imams of the Maliki madhab. He's not Ibn Arabi, the well-known Sufi scholar who wrote tafsir, which is attributed to him. Some people don't attribute it to him. That's a different person. Although his name is also Ibn Arabi, and he's also from Andalus. And they lived not too far from each other in terms of time. But we're talking about Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, the Maliki judge, and Maliki scholar, and Maliki faqih. Then many other scholars came after that in the Maliki madhab, and they've got some important books. From the later books that were very important is Mukhtasar Khalil, which is a short book, and then many books were sort of based around that book. Yeah, Mukhtasar Khalil, many books were based on that book, like Mawahib al-Jalil and Hashiyat al-Dasuqi, and various other books, explanations of Mukhtasar Khalil. Before that, of course, the Risala by Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, also an important Maliki text. The Maliki madhab is widespread today in North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, West Africa as well, Senegal, Congo, Nigeria, and like we said last week, Sudan and so on. طيب, the Shafi'i madhab, Al-Imam al-Shafi'i, he was a scholar of the next generation. So if you think of it as the earlier generations were the generation of Malik and Abu Hanifa. Yeah, they were roughly at a similar time. The student of Malik was Shafi'i. So Shafi'i came after Malik. Shafi'i, we didn't talk about dates of birth and death. Abu Hanifa was born 80 years after Hijrah, and he passed away 150 years after Hijrah. Malik was born how many years after Hijrah? 93. And he passed away 179. So he lived quite a long life, almost 90 years. Shafi'i was born in the same year that Abu Hanifa died. Shafi'i was born in the same year Abu Hanifa died. So he was born 150 years after the Hijrah. And he passed away 204 after the Hijrah. So Shafi'i lived quite a short life, only 54 years. Even though he made huge contributions to Islamic knowledge. May Allah have mercy on him. Shafi'i was a graduate from the school of Ahlul Hadith, which was in Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, and Ahlul Ra'i in Kufa. And Shafi'i studied with Abu Yusuf and with Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, studied with both of them, and benefited from them a lot, and had a lot of debates with them and discussions, and they respected each other a lot. Muhammad respected Shafi'i and Shafi'i respected Muhammad. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is reported about him that he said, لا زال أهل الرأي يلعنوننا ونلعنهم. We were continuing to curse Ahlul Ra'i, and Ahlul Ra'i were cursing us meaning Ahlul Hadith, until Shafi'i came. فجاء الشافعي فألف بين قلوبنا. So Shafi'i came and brought the hearts together, because Shafi'i was such a sharp person, rahimahullah, and he was a student from the school of Ahlul Hadith in Medina. So he was able to show that, look, we need hadith. There's no knowledge without hadith. But at the same time, we also need opinion and ijtihad, so that we understand the ahadith as they were intended. So Ahlul Hadith started to take more concern in regards to fiqh and the knowledge of hadith and interpreting hadith and the tafsir of hadith and so on. And this is why some of the leading scholars of Ahlul Hadith, who were companions of Ahmad, they used to love Shafi'i. They used to love Imam Shafi'i. Like Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Ishaq ibn Rahawi. Ishaq was like a copy of Ahmad. Him and Ahmad might as well be one person. Literally a copy of each other. Very similar approach in knowledge. Exceptional knowledge of hadith and scholars of fiqh as well. Ishaq ibn Rahawi. And they were close friends also. And the third one is Abu Ubaid, Al-Qasim ibn Salam. Also a leading scholar in hadith. And he has a very important book called Gharib al-Hadith. As well as that, Abu Thawr. Abu Thawr was a student of a Shafi'i. And we said Abu Thawr was someone who had his own school. He had students that followed his school. And some of our teachers say that if Abu Thawr's students carried his knowledge, then his fiqh would have become more widespread than the fiqh of Imam Ahmad. Because Abu Thawr was a big scholar of fiqh, and he was a contemporary of Imam Ahmad. So these Imams of Ahl al-Hadith, they loved the Shafi'i. They loved him a lot. Because al-Shafi'i taught them how to be more concerned about the fiqh of hadith. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. Malik was the Imam of the fuqaha of hadith. It doesn't mean that the scholars of hadith didn't know fiqh. It doesn't mean that at all. But it just means that al-Shafi'i taught them to emphasize this issue more. And al-Shafi'i encouraged them to look at the methods of interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. And he even wrote a whole book called Al-Risala. He wrote a book called Al-Risala. Al-Risala, which is a book in Usul al-Fiqh. An exceptional book. And this is considered the earliest book in Usul al-Fiqh. Usul al-Fiqh means the principles of fiqh. The methods of understanding the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. That's what Usul al-Fiqh is about. Al-Shafi'i is considered the earliest scholar to have written a proper book specifically on this issue. And this book is now printed, alhamdulillah, and it's translated into English. It's been printed and it's been translated into English also. Al-Risala by Shafi'i. And it was actually the request of one of the great scholars of hadith, who was Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. He wanted Al-Shafi'i to write something like this. He told him, write something about Al-Nasikh wal-Mansukh, abrogations, as well as Al-Am wal-Khas and things like that. He asked him to write it. So Al-Shafi'i wrote a Risala. And it was, tahqiq of this Risala was made by Shaykh Ahmad Shakir, rahmatullahi alayh.
You mentioned Al-Risala as part of Maliki as well. Maliki books, is that right?
No.
No.
Oh, yes, of course. That's a different Risala. Nah. That's a Risala by Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. Nah. He was one of the Maliki scholars, but this is a book of fiqh. The Maliki one is a book of fiqh. Halal and haram. Whereas the Risala by Shafi'i is in Usul al-Fiqh. It's a different book. Some of the scholars saw Ahmad ibn Hanbal sitting in the gatherings of Shafi'i. So they said to him, why are you leaving Sufyan ibn Uyayna? Sufyan ibn Uyayna is a scholar of hadith, and he was more senior to a Shafi'i. He said, why are you leaving Sufyan ibn Uyayna and going to this little kid? Because he was roughly their age. The Shafi'i wasn't that much older than them. So they didn't you perhaps use the word kid, but they said this person who is young in age. Yeah? This young person. Why are you sitting with this young person? So Ahmad said, if you don't get a hadith from Sufyan bi'ulu, with a shorter chain of narration, adraktahu binuzul, you'll find that same hadith elsewhere. Hadith is widespread, alhamdulillah. If I don't study hadith with him, I can study it with someone else. If I don't have the hadith from Sufyan, I'll find it with someone else. He said, but if the intellect of this man misses you, you're never going to find it anywhere else. He says, if you don't take advantage of a Shafi'i, the knowledge and his intellect will go. You're not going to find it anywhere else. Whereas hadith, we can find it with other scholars. So Ahmad was a big fan of Imam Shafi'i. Highly respected Imam Shafi'i. Anyway, Al-Shafi'i had many scholars who were his students. Al-Muzani, like we said, Abu Thawr was one of his students also. We said Ahmad ibn Hanbal, of course, the most famous of his students. All of them carried on his approach. All of them carried on his approach of fiqh, mixing fiqh with hadith. And this is really important, by the way, in knowledge, that we can mix between narrations and between understanding. Not just narrations where they're not being understood properly. And this is actually something the Prophet ﷺ indicated towards. قال نضر الله امرأ سمع مقالتي فوعاها فأداها كما سمعها. May Allah lighten up a person who hears a narration that comes from me and passes it on as he hears it. فرب مبلغ أو عام سامع ورب حامل فقه إلى من هو أفقه منه. Because perhaps the one who is listening is not as knowledgeable as the one who passes on the hadith to someone after him. So that shows that a person who has knowledge of hadith could be passing it on to someone who has a better understanding of hadith than him. And that means that there's a difference between just having hadith as a word, as a statement, and between having sound understanding in hadith. Al-Shafi'i was so special because he was strong in both areas. And this is what distinguishes these types of scholars. Anyhow, there were many scholars, so that we don't take too long, many scholars in the Shafi'i madhab who then took on his knowledge. Al-Muzani wrote a small book. Al-Shafi'i himself wrote a book. Unlike Abu Hanifa, who didn't write a single book in fiqh. And many scholars say he didn't write a single book full stop. None of his books reach us. And what's attributed to him of Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, a lot of people consider that to not be his book, but it's something that his students wrote on his behalf. So Abu Hanifa didn't really write, but his students wrote. Yeah. Whereas Malik, he wrote one book, and that is Al-Muwatta. And Al-Shafi'i also wrote. We said he wrote a Risala, and he also wrote the Masail al-Fiqh. Now, I don't recall. It is a Shafi'i's book, but I don't recall Previously, I was under the impression it was his book, but recently I've read up on some different research that some scholars have mentioned, that perhaps it's written by his students. So it's quite possible that it was narrated by Shafi'i and then written down by his students. Something to check, and then I'll get back to you next week about that, inshallah. Whether a Shafi'i authored it himself, or whether a Shafi'i was just simply passing on knowledge that his students wrote. Yeah, I'll have to confirm that, inshallah. But Al-Umm is considered his book. It's his book. Al-Umm is always attributed to Shafi'i. Yeah? But was he the one who wrote it down in his time? When he was alive, he wrote it? Or was it something that was written by his students on his behalf? That's something that we'll get back to you. But either way, what's in Al-Umm is a Shafi'i. Yeah? That's the most important thing. What's in Al-Umm is a Shafi'i's knowledge. That's what we're concerned about. No. And the difference isn't huge. Because whether he's the one who wrote it on paper, or whether it's someone else who wrote it on his behalf, it's not a huge problem. Because ultimately we can verify that this is correctly attributed to a Shafi'i. No. And like I said, I'll get back to you about him writing it or not. Also, some of the leading scholars, when it comes to hadith, the scholars of the Shafi'i madhab were leading the way. Many of the scholars of hadith were Shafi'i. Many of the scholars of hadith were considered Shafi'i scholars. Some of them are attributed to the Shafi'i madhab because they were influenced by the Shafi'i school. But maybe they're considered independent scholars. Independent scholars. Everyone is influenced by everyone. Ahmad is influenced by Shafi'i. It doesn't mean he's a Shafi'i. Abu Ubaid is influenced by Shafi'i. It doesn't mean he's a Shafi'i. Ishaq was influenced. Abu Thawr was influenced. It doesn't mean he's a Shafi'i. And this is why Al-Rafi'i, who was one of the leading Shafi'i scholars, later generations, he says Abu Thawr, even though he was one of the closest and most knowledgeable students of a Shafi'i, his opinions are not considered opinions in the Shafi'i madhab. Yeah? Why? Because Abu Thawr is an independent scholar. From those are Ibn Khuzaymah, Abu Bakr ibn Khuzaymah. They attribute him to the Shafi'i madhab. Obviously the Shafi'is try to claim him and say he's a Shafi'i, he's one of us. But Ibn Khuzaymah is not great enough to be a scholar in his own right. And in fact, he had students and he had followers. And his most famous student is Dawood? Yeah. Dawood will come later. Dawood is older than Ibn Khuzaymah. Who's the most famous student of Ibn Khuzaymah? He has a famous book of hadith as well that we all know. Or that many of us know. That's much later. Who? Sahih? لا, Nasa'i is older. No, Muslim's older than Ibn Khuzaymah. Jazakallah khair. Yes, Sahih ibn Hibban. No, Sahih ibn Hibban. Ibn Hibban is a student of Ibn Khuzaymah. He's one of his most well-known students. Ibn Hibban is Abu Hatim. Abu Hatim ibn Hibban al-Busti. He also wrote in hadith. Also someone who's attributed to the Shafi'i school. But again, Ibn Hibban was a leading scholar himself. Ibn al-Mundir is also considered a scholar, attributed to the Shafi'i school, but he might as well be an independent scholar as well. Al-Bayhaqi, however, is a Shafi'i. Al-Bayhaqi was a hardcore Shafi'i. And he wrote books defending the Shafi'i madhab. And writing the evidences of the Shafi'i school, the fiqh of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah. And that's why they say famously, everyone who is a Shafi'i, in fact every Muslim, should be grateful to Al-Imam Shafi'i. Everyone should be grateful to a Shafi'i, except Al-Bayhaqi. Al-Shafi'i should be grateful to Al-Bayhaqi. Shafi'i should be grateful to Al-Bayhaqi, because Al-Bayhaqi is the one who spread the evidences of the Shafi'i madhab. Al-Bayhaqi wrote in his book As-Sunan Al-Kubra, this guy has written a good 10,000 or so ahadith. Huge number of ahadith. And is considered one of the most important books of hadith. Then we have the later scholars. We have four main names when it comes to the Shafi'i madhab who are scholars of fiqh. moving away from hadith now, and some of them were scholars of hadith also. The first two are Al-Rafi'i, who we just quoted now, and who? Shirazi also, just before. But there are two scholars who are considered authorities in the Shafi'i madhab. If they agree on something, that's the Shafi'i madhab. Al-Nawawi. Al-Imam Nawawi. Al-Nawawi is considered the Shaykh of the madhab. Al-Nawawi is considered the Shaykh of the madhab. And he was a scholar of hadith. And remember we said Al-Nawawi died in his 40s. This man died in his 40s. So Shafi'i died in his early 50s, and Nawawi died in his 40s, his early 40s. And yet what these two have managed to contribute to knowledge is unbelievable. Rahimahullah ta'ala. In the slightly later generations, so we're talking 400-500 years ago, there were two other Shafi'i scholars, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and al-Ramli. Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and al-Ramli. This is the Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. He's a different to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the Muhaddith. And he's a Shafi'i scholar as well. Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and al-Ramli are considered two leading scholars in the Shafi'i madhab, again considered the most authoritative in the Shafi'i school. And the Shafi'i madhab is widespread, like we said last week, in Somalia, in Egypt, in Malaysia, Indonesia. It's widespread in Yemen and various other countries. Finally, before we end, we look at the madhab of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah ta'ala.
These Ibn Qayyim and
They come with this madhab Ahmad.
Ibn Kathir.
Ibn Kathir is a Shafi'i. Ibn Kathir is Shafi'i. We didn't mention him because there are tons of scholars that we can mention, so we weren't able to mention everyone, but Ibn Kathir is a Shafi'i. But Ibn Kathir is a Shafi'i who's influenced by the Hanbali madhab as well, because of his teacher who is Ibn Taymiyyah, his teacher Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. Anyone who studied with Ibn Taymiyyah automatically is impacted by Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah is from the leading scholars of the Muslims. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the last of the four Imams, and the one who was most well known for his knowledge of hadith. He was such a respected personality at his time. No one could match him in terms of who he was. Highly respected individual. Highly respected individual. To the extent that it's reported that the teachers of Ahmad, when he was sitting to listen to hadith, the teachers of Ahmad would feel intimidated by Ahmad. Ahmad is coming as a student. He's coming to take hadith from his teachers. But the teachers would feel intimidated. And they mentioned that one of the teachers of Ahmad, whose name I don't recall, once mentioned a joke in his class. He told a joke in his class. Then Ahmad rahimahullah, he was an extremely serious person. He wasn't the type of person who jokes or messes about. So Ahmad did that. So he realized that Ahmad's in the circle. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me Ahmad's here? I wouldn't have made a joke otherwise." Rahimahullah ta'ala. Ahmad was a very serious person. And maybe that's why he was able to give his whole life to studying hadith. And this type of personality is needed. And this is something important, that for someone to be serious and to never play about and to never joke about and to always be focused on studying, is that a good thing or a bad thing? We need that. We need that. If it wasn't for people like Imam Ahmad, well, then a lot of knowledge would be, we'd be running after knowledge, looking for someone to explain to us the words of Allah, the words of the Prophet. But does that mean the whole ummah needs to be like that? No. And that's where sometimes things go wrong. A person reads how the scholars of hadith were, like Malik. Malik was the same, no joking about. Once when Malik rahimahullah smiled or chuckled a little bit, they said to the guy who made him laugh, they said, "This is the first time we see him laugh. In years, this is the first time we see him laugh." Can you imagine that? The first time that they see somebody. So it's not a problem that we have these types of individuals. In fact, we need them. It's wrong to think that we should impose that on everyone, because that doesn't work. That's not how life works. People have different personalities. People have different approaches. People have different just ways of going about. And that's a good thing. And we need that. If everyone was serious and boring, then life would be quite boring. And if everyone was a joker, then life would be a joke. So that balance is needed. That balance is needed. So Ahmad rahimahullah was a very serious person, a student of hadith. He went around the whole world taking hadith. He travelled more than any other scholar. From these 4 Imams, no one travelled more than him. He went everywhere. He went everywhere to take hadith. He went to Medina, he went to Mecca, he went to Baghdad, he went to Basra, he went to Kufa, he went to Egypt. He went anywhere which had knowledge that he knew he could take knowledge from, he would go. Like we said, Ahmad didn't actually want for people to write his opinions down, because he wanted people to be connected to the words of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's how the Imams of Ahl al-Hadith were. They wanted that. But, as we said, there is a need for understanding the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is why the students of Ahmad were so concerned to write down the views of Ahmad. The views of Ahmad. And we need both. We need both. As we said, we need hadith and we need ijtihad. And that's why Abdullah ibn Mubarak rahimahullah says, عليكم بهذا الأثر. Take with this athar, hadith. وَخُذُوا مِنَ الرَّأْيِ مَا يُفَسِّرُ لَكُمُ الْحَدِيثِ. And take from ra'i, opinion, and ijtihad, that which helps you to interpret hadith. Helps you to understand hadith. So, the students of Ahmad wrote his knowledge. Who is one of the most well-known students of Ahmad? Another scholar of hadith that you will know. Al-Bukhari, not so much. He was, briefly, but Al-Bukhari was someone who didn't spend too much time with Ahmad. Abu Dawud Sijistani, the author of Sunan Abi Dawud. Abu Dawud was a very, very close student of Ahmad. And Abu Dawud compiled what we now today know as Su'alat Abi Dawud, or Masail Abi Dawud. Questions that Abu Dawud asked Ahmad. Questions Abu Dawud asked Ahmad, and they're now compiled. And it's printed, alhamdulillah. So all the questions that Abu Dawud asked Ahmad, obviously not every question that he's ever asked, but he compiled questions that he asked Ahmad, and these answers were then compiled. Muslim, Ibn al-Hajjaj and al-Bukhari, as we said, although they were around in the period of Ahmad, they were not close students of Ahmad. Okay, they were not close students of Ahmad. Age was one thing to do, because it was one thing that came into it. Ahmad was earlier than them. So, Al-Bukhari and Muslim typically studied with people who were slightly younger than Ahmad. Okay, like Abu Bakr, Abdullah ibn Zubayr al-Humaydi, and Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhli, and a few other scholars of hadith. Abu Bakr al-Khallal, who was the grand student of Ahmad, grand student meaning the student of his students. He went around the student of Ahmad. Of course, we forget his 2 sons. Imam Ahmad had 2 sons who were scholars of hadith. Salih and Abdullah being the most famous of his sons. Abdullah has a whole book, a well-known book called Sunnah, which is mainly in Usul al-Din, Aqidah. And Abdullah is the one who narrated the Musnad of Ahmad. The Musnad of Ahmad, which consists of almost 30,000 hadith, is a book that was compiled by who, or narrated by who? Abdullah, his son. It's from Ahmad's book, and Ahmad would teach his book and read his book to his students, some of his close students. One of them is Abdullah, his own son. Okay, so the Musnad that we have today is through Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. Of course, Hanbal is the grandfather of Ahmad. So his father's name is not Hanbal. We say Ahmad ibn Hanbal. His father's name is not Hanbal. He is attributed to his grandfather. He is Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. Ahmad was born 169 years after the Hijrah. And he passed away 241 years after the Hijrah. Rahimahullah ta'ala. Anyway, we have some leading scholars in the Hanbali madhab before we end. Because we've taken longer than I want to take. Some of the most well-known scholars in the Hanbali madhab include who? Ibn Qudamah, the Shaykh of the madhab, Ibn Rajab, definitely Zainuddin ibn Rajab, one of the Imams of the Hanbali school, who's the student of Ibn Rajab, is the student of who? Ibn al-Qayyim. And Ibn al-Qayyim is a student of Ibn Taymiyyah. And of course we have the grandfather and the father and the grandson. So we have the grandfather, who is al-Majd Ibn Taymiyyah, and we have the son of him, his son, who is Abdul Halim Ibn Taymiyyah, who is also a scholar of fiqh and a scholar of usul and a Hanbali scholar of fiqh. And then we have the grandson, and the grandson is the most famous of them. He is Ahmad ibn Abdul Halim ibn Abdul Salam ibn Taymiyyah al-Harrani. His name is Ahmad, as we said, Ahmad ibn Abdul Halim. We're better known now as Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. So when we say Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, we're referring to the grandson, who is Ahmad ibn Abdul Halim ibn Abdul Salam. But he's not the only Ibn Taymiyyah who's a scholar. His grandfather is a leading scholar. His grandfather is a leading scholar. So is his father. His father is not that well known. No. And the scholars say that his father came in between a giant and another giant. So his father's a huge scholar and his son is a huge scholar, so he sort of disappeared in between them. So his grandfather was a well-known scholar, and his father was a well-known scholar, and his son was a well-known scholar. And so because they were so well-known, he almost got hidden away and isn't so well-known. But he's still, as we said, a scholar, and we still have his opinions in the Hanbali madhab. Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil, Abu Khattab al-Kalwadani are all leading scholars in the Hanbali madhab. The school of Ibn Taymiyyah was like a reformer. So Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali, but he has a certain approach as well to his knowledge, and he influenced many students. From the students he influenced were Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Kathir and al-Dhahabi and Ibn Muflih. Ibn Muflih is considered the leader of all these students in fiqh. Ibn al-Qayyim would go to Ibn Muflih to know what the opinions of Ibn Taymiyyah are. Ibn al-Qayyim would go to Ibn Muflih to know the opinions of Ibn Taymiyyah, his own teacher. Because Ibn Muflih was a close student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Muflih focused more on fiqh, whereas Ibn al-Qayyim was more of an encyclopedia, rahimahullah, like his teacher. We also have other teachers of Ibn Taymiyyah, like Ibn Qadi al-Jabal. Ibn Qadi al-Jabal was also from the leading scholars of the Hanbali madhab. We have Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi, who's a Shafi'i scholar, but he was a companion of Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah would go to him for hadith, because Al-Hafiz, Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi, was like the Malik of his time. He was a giant when it came to the science of hadith. This school was a very much reformist school, because it wasn't that typical sort of, just this is what our shuyukh in the Hanbali madhab say, let's just pass it on. This is what the scholars say, let's just pass it on. No, Ibn Taymiyyah was critical. He criticized, he questioned, he had different opinions, and that's why people had a problem with him. And that's the case, and we'll come to see that when it comes to reformers throughout Islamic history, in fiqh, people who are considered reformers, who took on a different approach to maybe the mainstream, which people find difficult to take, because people don't like you going against the mainstream, wherever you are. So this school caused a big rift. Ibn Taymiyyah's school caused a big rift. And it's not his school that he came up with, it's just he was outspoken. It's just that he wrote books. Otherwise, his grandfather's not that much different. His grandfather also had this ijtihadi approach. Other scholars also had this ijtihadi approach. Okay, of going in. I don't agree that this is the Hanbali method. I don't agree that this is a correct opinion. What's the problem with that? He's a scholar. He has to follow you and your granddad for the rest of his life. He's a person of knowledge. He has the right to speak about the Sharia. He has a right to speak about what he believes is correct, so long as it's based on correct and appropriate principles, which is of course the case with Ibn Taymiyyah. From this school is also Ibn Rajab that you mentioned. Ibn Rajab is from this school. He's not the direct student of Ibn Taymiyyah, but he's from the Taymi school. And As-Subki who is one of the hardcore Ash'ari, has a problem with this school. He doesn't like this school. And whenever he's upset with, Ibn Kathir, Al-Dhahabi is his own teacher. So, Subki is the student of Al-Dhahabi. Whenever he's upset with some of the opinions of Al-Dhahabi in Aqeedah especially, and things like that, he says, and this is because of the influence of his teacher. This is the influence of his teacher, Ibn Taymiyyah. And this of course goes back to what I said earlier about scholars sometimes having different opinions on issues. Yes.
Is Ibn Qayyim considered a mainstream Hanbali?
Yes. Ibn Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah is an Imam in the Hanbali madhab. It's good that you pointed this out. Because some people claim that Ibn Taymiyyah is not from the Hanbali madhab. Only someone who doesn't know the Hanbali madhab will say that. Because every single book after Ibn Taymiyyah mentions Ibn Taymiyyah's opinions. The most important books in the Hanbali madhab mention the views of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is a Hanbali, and he's an Imam in the Hanbali madhab. So his opinions are considered opinions in the madhab. And this is why Shaykh Mar'i al-Karmi, who is considered from the authorities in the Hanbali madhab, when he spoke about talaq, the issue of talaq, 3 talaqs in one. The famous opinion of the four madhab is that 3 talaqs count as 3 talaqs. And the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah is that 3 talaqs count as 1 talaq. And it's not just Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way. When people don't like someone, they just associate it to the guy they don't like. People who held that opinion before him. Shaykh Mar'i al-Karmi says there's no harm in giving fatwa according to the opinions of Ibn Taymiyyah, like his view on talaq. So this opinion on talaq is an opinion in the Hanbali madhab. It's not an opinion outside of Islam. It's not an opinion outside of the scope of Ahl Sunnah. And it's not an opinion outside of the Hanbali madhab. It's within the Hanbali madhab. So Ibn Taymiyyah is considered a scholar in the Hanbali. Ibn Qayyim as well. Because the Hanbali scholars refer to him. And they often quote his book, his most famous book in fiqh, which is Zahed al-Ma'ad fi Hadi Khair al-Ibad. And they usually call it Al-Hadi. They call it Al-Hadi. They don't usually call it Zahed al-Ma'ad. Anyways, the Hanbali madhab recently became more widespread because the scholars of Najd, Riyadh, Mecca, Medina, etc. took on the Hanbali madhab. And the sort of school of Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which was one of the contemporary movements in Najd, this school, sort of pushed the Hanbali madhab because they were Hanbalis, and so the Hanbali madhab was sort of pushed by them. And behind them was a state. And every time you have a state behind you, that obviously helps to spread madhab and so on. And that's why the Hanafi madhab spread, that's why the Shafi'i madhab spread. A lot of it was to do with the state. If the state adopted something, then obviously that helps in spreading. We have no problem. Whether the Hanbali madhab spreads, or the Hanafi madhab, or the Shafi'i madhab, all of them are taking their knowledge from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so it's not a big issue. Now, we'll leave it at that inshallah. Final comments and then we'll end it.
Imam al-Ghazali doesn't form part of any school.
Imam al-Ghazali is considered from the leading scholars of the Shafi'i madhab, and his opinions in the Shafi'i madhab are considered authoritative. And Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the famous author of Ihya Ulumuddin, as well as a number of books in fiqh and usul. Al-Ghazali is an imam in fiqh, and an imam in usul al-fiqh, and an imam in tasawwuf also, because he's considered from the leading scholars of spirituality and so on. No. Do we have any final comments? I know there was a lot that we went through, quick run through history, but hopefully there was some use. Tfadal.
From among these 4 schools, how they developed, what did spirituality have to play a part in all of this?
What does spirituality have to do?
Did it have any
Spirituality and the schools of fiqh are irrelevant. And this is why you'll find scholars within all of the 4 schools who had more of a spiritual approach. So you'll find scholars in the Hanafi school who are very much focused on their spirituality. Scholars in the Maliki, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali school very much focused on their spirituality. They claim that the Hanbalis are the most focused on spirituality. That's what they say. Although I don't like that type of generalization. They say that because the Hanbalis didn't really have a state behind them. They didn't really like taking positions with the state, like being a judge and things like that. So they kept away from all of that. So they say that the Hanbalis were very much people of worship and so on. But that's not something to say as a general statement. Every madhab has scholars who are more focused on spirituality and others may be less focused on spirituality. That's just how it is. So the two are irrelevant. No. جزاكم الله خيرا سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والحمد لله رب العالمين. Next week the lesson is at what time? 7 o'clock. Next week the lesson is at 7 o'clock until Isha, which is at 8 o'clock inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. Salam alaikum. Thanks. All right. How is the hospital?